So, in this recording, I'm going to talk about Bonaventure's um, journey of the mind to God and steps one and two. So, that does correspond to chapters one and two. And so, step one is titled The Steps in the Ascent to God and the Consideration of Him Through His Vestiges in the Universe. And step two is the consideration of God in His vestiges in the visible world. All right, so I'll go to step one first. So in the previous video, I talked about the 6 steps and then the 7th chapter. So steps one and two are about the the material world and how the material world um, is pretty much the first 2 steps in your ascent to God. So just in general, to talk about the ascent, what is the point of the ascent to God? Why is anyone interested in ascending to God? Well, it's because we are made to enjoy the supreme good. Okay, but the supreme good is above us, right? So we have to rise above ourselves. And so to be happy, that's to be perfect, perfected, to be fulfilled, we have to ascend to the supreme good. So this requires an ascent, but it is not a bodily ascent. Okay, it is it is an ascent of the heart. All right, so this is similar to what we see in Plotinus. And Plotinus's model of ascent to God is one that requires you to go inward to go upward. Okay, to get to the one, to ascend upward, you go inward. Now, Bonaventure is, and as you'll find with most Christian theologians, there's another step which is prior to going inward, which is the engaging the visible world, right? And that becomes part of the steps to ascent. So in step one, we see that the material world is a rung in the ladder of ascent. And because of human weakness, we're untrained and unable to rise to the supreme good, right? That's because in as human beings, we're so caught up with what we see, taste, smell, sense, and our world is sort of conceived in those terms. So the first 2 steps are to help us begin to discipline our senses, right? So we can then put our body and our senses under control and then take a major step towards ascending towards God. So in this first step, creatures are basically anything that exists that's not God, right? But the visible world, the universe, Saturn, Mars, all these stars and star systems, beetles, bugs, everything, creatures, okay, are what Bonaventure calls shadows. Oops. They're echoes and pictures, okay, of God. So creatures are shadows, echoes, and pictures of God. And that brings us to the word vestige, right? So the word vestige can mean like a remnant, something that's left over. All right, so you can think of traditions as a vestige. So you can say that, such as maybe the tradition of wearing graduation gowns is a vestige of medieval times, right? Something that's left over from a certain time period. So a vestige usually implies that there's something came before. All right, so when we think of the world as a vestige of God, we're saying that the world in some ways is an echo of God. It implies that there's something else that's prior to the world and possibly sustains the world. So in this idea, in this step, the idea here in considering the God through the vestiges in the universe, right? You take a look at the totality of everything, see how everything works together. The idea here is that you view nature in its proper context. right? And in so doing, right, you get to see that nature is quite simply not the cause of itself. Okay, so you examine nature, you realize its eternal splendor. Okay, and you see that nature is, so when we say nature, that again, anything that's created. So nature is a signpost, essentially, of something else beyond itself. Right? So in step one, we see created things as vestiges. That means everything that's created, the whole world, the whole universe, right? Universe of things, everything speaks of something beyond itself. And then Bonaventure concludes by saying, therefore, whoever is not enlightened by such great splendor in created things is blind. Whoever remains unheedful of such great outcries is deaf, right? So even though clearly you may not be blind, you can see, you can see the screen, you can see what's around you. Um, but you're only seeing with your physical eyes, right? So you are still trapped by your physical senses. And we'll see in steps 3 and 4, the idea is actually to develop your spiritual senses so you can actually begin to see clearly, right, with the eyes of the mind. All right, so that's step one. Okay, it's to look at universe through the vestiges to see that everything essentially is an effect, and there's a cause for everything that's created. So in step two, we go beyond seeing creatures as mere signposts. Okay, so it's not just enough to see that, oh, everything is created, so there's the createdness about everything, right? And that implies a creator. We go beyond seeing that, right? We now begin to look into creatures and see how God is present in them. Excuse me. And so there are a couple of ways this happens. One is as you know things, right? So in the process of knowing things, right, we see fundamental truths about the world, and we see God. We see God as we see these truths about the world. Okay, so for instance, when you think about the conditions for knowledge, you think of a pre-existent eternal structures and pre-existent illumination that make knowledge possible, right? So when you think about the fact that you've learned so much about the world, right, and you sort of think of what's axiomatic, what are the very basic things, building blocks of our knowledge, and you sort of realize to some degree that these things, in knowing the world and seeing all these great things about the world, we see that some of this is gifted to us at some fundamental level, right? Our ability to think critically, logically, to make these inferences, the ability to see things, right, in this and put everything together, is something. It's a gift, right, and that doesn't come from us, and that speaks of God. Okay, Bonaventure uses the example of light. So light is the reason we see, right? But we don't see light itself. Right, so the fact that you're seeing this means that you are experiencing light, but you don't see the light itself. Light is a reason that you're seeing everything else. Now, if light was absent, you can't see, right? So it's the same thing. You begin to realize that there is this divine illumination, there is this divine presence that's active at a very base level in all of human knowledge, right? And that speaks of God's existence. Now, there's also another aspect to this as we begin to know the world, so we get more familiar with the world, right? We see um, beauty. Another way you can think of it is order and structure in the world. right? So if you think of beauty, beauty is just simply that you're recognizing some kind of structure. That's really what beauty is, right? So when you think of words like elegant or beauty, you think of proportion and structure, right? And that's so we can think of beauty that way. And the recognition of beauty, the recognition of structure, of um, proportion, depends on, let me just say this, recognition of beauty. I'll just say order, structure, however you want to think of it, depends on the phenomenon of numbers, right? We could just say mathematics. So it's essentially when you see structure, you're essentially doing a mathematical operation, right? When you listen to music, that is a mathematical operation. You're dealing with sound waves that have certain amplitudes, or you're dealing with beats, right? And so when you dance, for instance, you're essentially expressing rhythms, which are numbers interacting, right? And so when you begin to look at the world and look more closely, so in music, in art, in biology and psychology, as you study different things, right, you begin to see structure, beauty, and order. And then you look beyond that and you see just the whole phenomenon of the mathematics behind everything. And you recognize that numbers are these defining elements that are present in the world and structure the world in a very fundamental way. And then you come to realize, well, those numbers represent something far bigger than any of us and are prior to us, and sort of the reason why we have this fundamental structure in the world. Okay, so in seeing how we come to know things and in recognizing beauty, right, we also now begin to get stronger hints of something about the nature of God Himself. Okay, so the first two steps, right, are about recognizing God in the world, right? So you understand that the world is a vestige of God. You recognize God in the world in general as some sort of signpost, but also when you look closer, you begin to see, you begin to recognize the conditions for knowledge, right? The fact that that in our coming to know things, right? When we reflect on that process, um, we see that God is the reason we actually come to know things, right? And also when we recognize beauty or order, structure, then we also recognize that um, there is something more eternal that's ordering everything and giving everything this beauty that we've recognized.